Hello everyone, welcome back to the How I Rehab podcast, brought to you by the SportsMap Network. I am your host, Nick Kane, and today we'll be talking towards navigating the troublesome hamstring injury, and we'll be doing that with Dr Martin McIntyre. Dr Martin McIntyre brings a wealth of experience towards talking to hamstring injuries. He is completing or has completed his PhD at the Liverpool University, looking at hamstring muscle strength assessment and the association with injury risk in Gaelic football. He's worked with many of the top teams in Ireland, or at the top level with some teams in Ireland, most recently Mayo in his county, working for the senior football team. So brings together, someone who works in the field with sports, and Gaelic, for those that don't know it, is a really fast-paced field sport, similar to, a cross between Aussie rules football and soccer or English football. And obviously also having done further extensive research on hamstrings, and he's consulting a lot around in the Premier League at the moment, and he's the founder of HRIG, which is a product that he'll touch on around used to assess asymmetric strength in hamstrings in a more running specific position. So really interesting take on trying to tease out some takeaways for those that get the recurring hamstring and how we can delve a little bit deeper, and also talk to HRIG in the sense of a new product. So enjoy this podcast. But before we jump into that, we are going to just touch on, our a couple of great developments recently at SportsMap, and our masterclass platform continues to pump out some tremendous learning content. In the last month, we had a double masterclass release month with Michael O'Brien on hip dysplasia in adults, followed by Tim McGrath on PCL injuries, and Tim's currently working in the NFL. And very, very knowledgeable around ACLs and PCLs. So some quality work there, and still plenty to come. So if we're talking calf and Achilles regions, we've got Shane Kelly from British Athletics, Seth O'Neill, and Michael Lancaster from the rugby scene in the UK. His masterclass coming out in the future, and Claire Robertson with patellofemoral pain, and Jonas Dodoto. So plenty more coming our way, and that's all access to every single masterclass we've ever had, and that's for less than $30 a month Australian. So if you are in the UK or US, it's closer to around £15-16 or US dollars a month. So certainly not a whole huge investment to maintain your education and CPD with some great content. We've got a recent announcement which was fantastic with the Association of Chartered Physiotherapists and Sports and Exercise Medicine Clinicians, the Sports Physio Group in the UK. So if you're a member of that group, ACP, SEM, you get some added benefits to SportsMap and discount rates and things like that to our masterclass. So be sure to engage with ACP, SEM there if you are a member, and come across to get some of that great benefits of that partnership that we're looking forward to really growing over the years. And for those who don't know, we do have a fantastic offering around group subscriptions for this. So an example, Kiza, which is a really big company here in Australia with lots of physios are on board, where their staff get exclusive access to our group subscription offering. So one, it's a discounted rate for larger numbers of clinicians, but it's all housed in one login, so you can really track and view what all staff are watching and viewing, and really create a program within your clinic, whether it's big or small. Okay, and event-wise at SportsMap, if you're watching this on YouTube, you'll get to see some dates, but if you're listening to it, you might need to head over to the website so you can see them all clearly and get the dates together, because there's a fair bit happening. We have our How I Rehab lower limb course, which is in Los Angeles at the end of August. There's only 10 spots left for that at the current time, so that will sell out. It's a very niche amount of people, and it's held at the brand new Intuit Dome, which is the home of the LA Clippers. It's a $2 billion stadium. Obviously won't be using the whole stadium, but we'll be having great access to, the physio and gym space to be able to run this course. So that's going to be really cool. Then we have Brady Green. He's looking at a calf injury management course. It's going to be really workshop-based. It's a one-day event, so highly practical, taking us through from assessment to rehab and to end-stage return to play, September the 14th. That's in Melbourne. So those who don't know, Brady Green has a PhD in calf injury prevention, calf injury management. You can tap into some past podcasts with Brady that we've had here, and in fact present a couple of our courses as well. So really great content there for calf injuries. And then finally, we have our Solving Soft Tissue Injury Conference in February 2025, which is in Melbourne. So that's our larger scale conference. Yes, there is a bit of a soft tissue theme this year that we're really pushing along, because I think the hamstrings and the quads and the calves are often the biggest cost, biggest burden, but also sometimes the difficult ones to sort of nail down, especially if we're getting any recurring issues, hence this podcast today. So at that conference, we've got David Opar, Sam Peach, who's doing PhD in quad injuries, rec fem injuries, Scotty Hulme, who talks to aponeurotic injuries. He's had a podcast before with Seth O'Neill, will be over from the UK for that event in Melbourne. Jacqueline Benz, who's head physio for the women's football or soccer team in Australia. And then we have a number of others to be announced and released in the coming weeks to sort of round that conference out. So 2-day conference in Melbourne is going to be heaps of fun, just like last year. It will sell out. So and there will be virtual access available. So looking forward to bringing some awesome content to everyone. Okay. It does take a little bit of time to try to get through all what's going on at SportsMap between the masterclass and events, but now we can get on to the podcast with Martin. So hope you enjoy this chat and thanks for jumping on. Welcome to the podcast, Martin. Pleasure to have you on and looking forward to chatting around hamstrings.
Hi, Nick. Great to be on with you today and really looking forward to it and can't wait to work with you further in the future as well.
Now, Martin, we are going to chat through, I guess, what we see as the difficult hamstring or some cases you've experienced in your time where you were seeing recurring hamstrings, whether that's second opinion cases or what have you, as I alluded to in the intro. But obviously, we'd be keen to hear a little bit about your background professionally and also where the interest in hamstring came about and, your balance of, I guess, work life now. What's that look like?
Sure, yeah, thanks. I suppose I started way back in 1996 in Liverpool, John Moores University. I studied there. First of all, I did sports science there under the guidership there of Professor Tom Riley. At the time I applied there, it was the only university outside of Ireland that you could do sport. We couldn't do sports science in Ireland, so I had to go to the UK to do it. So applied there, got in. Was wondering how I got in there in the first place because it's a hard place to get in, and I didn't realise till I got there that actually Professor Tom Riley lives up the road from us here. He's originally up the road from us, so that's how I got in there. So did 3 years sports science there, then was lucky enough to get employed in a university down south, MTU, and worked there as 10 years an exercise physiologist, kind of in performance physiology and applied physiology there, and got really interested in rehab. That's where it all started. Got really interested in rehab from a performance point of view, and studied and did a master's down there in physiological profiles, ran the exercise phys lab down there in terms of teaching and rehab and performance as well. And from there, then I went and studied sports medicine in Sheffield. And that's where it all really began about 17 years ago now. I studied that over there and set up a clinic in Mayo over 15 years ago now. So I've been working in clinical practice in sports medicine for the last 15 years. And over the last, I suppose, during that period, hamstrings is a really hot topic, especially in Gaelic football here in Ireland, and that's our primary sport. The incidence level is high for a number of reasons. It's higher actually than in soccer or rugby. And in 2017, the team I was involved with at the time, Mayo, 2 of our best players had a hamstring injury in a really big game in our Ireland semi-final. And it was really frustrating because I had everything. In our clinic here, we had everything. We had Shockwave, we had all the assessment tools, IKD, we're doing Nordic Falls, we're doing everything on our guys in terms of assessment and prescription that we believed was kind of at the forefront to kind of, I suppose, science and practice. And it was frustrating to have those 2 lads injured. And that's really when I decided, I need to study this in a bit more detail. We're not getting anywhere with this. And went back to John Moores in Liverpool and began a PhD on hamstrings in 2017. And I've been since having my head down, tail up, trying to research that a bit more and get a bit more insightful around the whole area.
All right, mate, beautiful. Obviously, it's such a fantastic career and in the space and so much, obviously, extra study in the PhD and the like with the hamstrings. I guess fill us in a little bit. I guess what you're doing right now. I know obviously you're involved with HRIG and also obviously you're still working clinically. What's your status at the moment like?
Yeah, so at the moment, following the PhD, we obviously did the research there and developed the HRIG from the initial PhD research, and also has done further product development for the last 3 or 4 years. So we launched that last year, the middle of last year. So at the moment, we're working with a lot of clubs in the UK and all around the world with that. in terms of assessment and prescription and rehab in terms of hamstrings. And then I work here locally with my intercounty side here, which is Mayo. So I work with the sports medicine team there. And also my clinic here is the sports injuries and sports medicine clinic. So we're based on the west coast of Ireland here. So that's my, I suppose, day-to-day job as well. So it's all about kind of combining those three together and working and providing services around them. So it's really interesting and working with different cohorts and population groups and seeing different injuries, but also specialising in hamstrings as well.
Yeah, cool. Why don't, before I jump in and chat a little bit around some hamstring cases and scenarios and trying to troubleshoot, fill us in on the H-rig. So if I haven't been on social media and the like, I probably don't know what that is. So what are we talking about here?
So the H-rig started from, I suppose, our investigations at PhD, where we looked at specifically at the association of strength and the relationship to hamstring injury. And from that, what we did there in the PhD is we looked at different modes and methods of treatment, looked at the mechanism of injury, specifically, I suppose, late swing, early stance, sprint phase. Depending on what you read, like 48% of all hamstring injuries, depending on the sport, involve sprinting in either late swing or early stance. That's the general mechanism, and it varies from sport to sport. For us in Gaelic football here, 80% of all our hamstring injuries come from that mechanism. In rugby, it's slightly lower, probably maybe 40% or so, and in Australian rules and soccer, somewhere in between. So we looked at the mechanism of injury and basically simulated the mechanism. So 150 degrees of knee extension and 20 degrees of contralateral hip extension. Did a lot of work around reliability, retest, ERV measurement, sensitivity, and came up with a protocol to assess, isometric protocol to assess hamstring function in that specific position. So what we found from that was that it was really sensitive in terms of prospective and retrospective injury. And we also found from a rehab point of view that we could safely and effectively load players to capacity and accelerate the recovery process because they're in that position which simulates the mechanism of injury again. And then we launched the H-rig, did all the research over the last 7 or 8 years around that, did all the product development with our team. Our team are based out of Sheffield Hallam University. So 3 guys there, 3 professors there look after the mechanical engineer, software engineer, and also electronics. So they've helped us develop it and bring it to market and launch it to market just over 12 months ago now, and working with clubs in the UK, here in Ireland, all around Europe as well. So it's been really interesting and kind of been a roller coaster since the last 10 or 12 months. A lot of traveling, but it's been really good.
No, it sounds like a really exciting venture, Martin, and I encourage people to have a look at the product themselves and see how it may integrate with what we're doing out there in the hamstring space. So well done on getting it together. It's never easy, business ventures like that. They're just, I imagine, just non-stop and consistently, always troubleshooting, always improving. It's an endless pursuit. So well done on all that. All right, so let's delve into a little bit more hamstrings and use that PhD and use that experience to, I guess, try to help us navigate our way through hamstrings and potentially, as we say, a stock standard hamstring is often not that difficult to get right a lot of the time. They'll, you could do heaps of things or you could do not many things and they'll probably get okay. But I think we've all been there where all of a sudden a hamstring is not that. It's difficult. They've re-injured and you're struggling to figure out why. Whether it's once or twice. And we sort of I'm going to pitch you'll pitch a little case to us that, in that sense, you might have experienced that. So, I mean, if you can do that, I guess, fill us in on a case where, you've been presented with things like that and whether that's been a second opinion or an athlete of your own, a little bit around the mechanism, the age and the sort of the issues they were having, and then we might just delve a little deeper from there.
Yeah, sure. Like there are many cases. We get many cases through our clinic and even the teams that we work with. And what you say is it's a difficult area. A lot of recurrent injuries. We know, like throughout the literature, like it's a high recurrence rate. 30% of them really recur, and obviously depending on the portion. whether it's intratendon or muscle involvement as well. So it's a difficult area. I suppose one case springs to mind for me in the recurrent injury at 3C. And came to us there in the last couple of months. And the first thing we did was obviously look at his imaging. So we use, generally from my practice here and the teams we work with, we use Ina Falvey in Cork, who's, as some of your listeners know, was heavily involved with IRFU and is involved with World Rugby. So he's a really good point of call for us in terms of looking at the imaging, first of all, to see does it match our clinical presentation. So that's, I suppose, merging those two. In this particular case, there was an 8 centimeter tear in, it was mid to distal, intramuscular, bicep fem, obviously. And what was really interesting in this case was when we assessed it clinically, it presented as a 3C, and we were looking at it and thinking maybe possibly we might be lucky here, it hasn't gone intratendon. But this guy had a really, really long intratendon aspect to his bicep fem. So it was extended distally, so he had an 8 centimeter tear in his in his bicep fem. So that was, I suppose, that was the first thing that we generally do. First of all, does it match clinically? Second of all, I suppose, is, and this is coming from my background in my PhD. One really cool paper, I think, and a really interesting paper. They've applied a model at the moment. Chris Barma, we were speaking earlier before we came on about him, and he's come up with a kind of really cool kind of way of and model in relation to hamstring injuries. So he divides it into two categories. First of all, applied strain, and second of all, in terms of strain capacity of the muscle, which is obviously your output. And for me, even the more I read the research, sometimes it can become a little bit confused. And for me, I just try to keep things as simple as possible. So obviously, there's stuff in relation to applied strain that's really important. But if you don't have the capacity and the strain capacity, or you don't have the performance output, that's the real big thing for me. I know we can have these. We've looked a lot of great research around intrinsic risk factors in relation to hamstring injury. But regardless of that, that affects obviously the applied strain. But if you don't have the capacity, first of all, whether you have those intrinsic risk factors prevalent or not, the strain capacity and the output is the most important factor for me when you boil it down to hamstring injuries.
All right, cool. With first question, just on that, what do you mean by intrinsic risk factors? Give us a couple of examples, maybe.
So I suppose if you look at applied strain, first of all, okay, if we look at late stance, early swing, we know that like from the work of Shumanov, Sash, and even recently Kennelly, Dabrowski in 2019, we look at the applied strain during late swing and early stance, you're looking at 36 newtons to 28 newtons per kg. So that equates to maybe 2, 3, 4,000 newtons of force of applied strain during those phases of that particular gait cycle. Then you look at, I suppose, playing, positioning and load. You look at the combination of running and kicking. You look at the intrinsic risk factors. So we know that obviously the modifiable and non-modifiable risk factors such as pelvic position, leg length, lordosis, kyphosis, hip angles, posterior chain, the effect of the knee and the ankle. So that all, I suppose, you can categorize that in relation to applied strain. So that will place strain upon the hamstrings. So some of those will be involved in the moment. I suppose when you look at the other side of the model, you're now looking at strain capacity. Has the hamstrings the capacity to be able to tolerate that applied strain? And that's where I try and keep things simple in terms of age, in terms of your strain capacity. Obviously, age is a factor. The material properties of the muscle in terms of your capacity and your output is also important in terms of a lot of good work in terms of aponeurosis and the relationship. And I've heard your recent podcasts, which are really insightful on aponeurosis and the relationship between total muscle volume. And even from our own PhD research, we've looked at muscle architecture and fascial length as well. And we know Ryan Timmons has done some great work there, where they say you need to extend beyond 10.56. In our research, we've looked at 50 players, direct measurement, ultrasound, and we're saying maybe in around the 10 centimeter mark as well. So we know that's important in terms of fascial length. muscular control and also motor unit recruitment is also really important in terms of output and strain capacity. So that's where I try and kind of simplify it for myself in terms of what are the factors that are going to affect the strain or the applied strain, and what do we need to tolerate, and have we the capacity then in terms of that strain to be able to, I suppose, reduce. Obviously, if we're going to try and reduce it, we need to have the capacity and the output to be able to tolerate that stress and strain in whichever sport we're involved in.
Okay, a little bit to break down there, but obviously, clearly well versed and know your stuff when it comes to hamstring. That's for sure. I'm going to pause in a sense and just go back to the imaging. So you mentioned NFLV, who we certainly are aware of through the work around, obviously, hip and groin as well, I believe, if that's correct. So I guess from the standpoint of what you were looking at there with imaging, are you purely looking at to see how it correlates with your symptoms or presentation? And what information did that give you, I guess, further to guide you and your rehab? So in respect to you, I guess I'm talking to timeframes a little bit, and then we might follow on from there.
Yeah, that's a really interesting one in terms of timeframes, in terms of that 3C. So that was an 8 centimeter. So what we're looking at, first of all, to see does it correlate with, obviously, palpation. It's been well versed in literature that palpation is really important measure of prognosis. So that's where palpation and obviously the site and the area. From that, then I suppose the clinical presentation in terms of your clinical assessment, is it matching in terms of your active straight leg raise and your active knee extension? Have you loss of range there? And then in terms of capacity and output, what we do with all our cases now that we have the H-rig on site here for the last 3 years or so, is we can assess them isometrically safely. So we look at the asymmetries between the affected and unaffected side, and we've actually done a correlation study on that in terms of MRI and imaging as well. So see those asymmetries on the H-rig match up with our, I suppose, MRI. And I think what I've found is we use Aina because it's really experienced. And it does provide us a lot of guidance in terms of prognosis. In terms of this clinical case, when we first went, it was 8 centimeters. And obviously, when you look at the literature, you're probably talking between 12 and 16 weeks, maybe in either side of that, or 1 or 2 weeks either side of that if you're really good. This particular case, we returned to sport after 6.5 weeks. And I remember we MRI'd him 7 days post. We MRI'd him 3 to 4 weeks post, and we MRI'd him again at 6 weeks. And at 6 weeks, his MRI was clear, which was like really, really surprising. So there was nothing clinically on an MRI. There was probably about 3 or 4 weeks before that, there was nothing clinically relevant as well in terms of his assessment and his clinical assessment. That had all cleared up. But it was surprising for us in that level of time that, 6.5 weeks post 3C injury, bicep fem, 8 centimeter tear, that it was clear on MRI as well. So that was really a really interesting case for us.
Okay. I was going to actually follow up and ask around that, further imaging. So let's say, well, in that case, you sort of explained that, and I'd anticipate you sort of doing your imaging at 3 or 4 weeks is almost like a serial, just to more guide you as you are closer to return to play. How, obviously, there's different research suggests certain elements within the importance of MRI and imaging to return to play, and others that would say it's not as relevant. Where would you sit on it? And how would MRI findings later, so let's say that 6-week scan, influence your decision making? So if we're to return to play.
Yeah, it's a really interesting question, Nick. We've been to a soccer club in the UK lately, and we spoke to them around this. And what they had essentially done was stopped using MRI to clear the players for return to play. I tend to agree with that somewhat. I tend to agree when I go back to our model again in terms of applied strain and strain capacity in your output. So have you the output, first of all? So in terms of you're hitting your running metrics, in terms of your load and volume, but in terms of your output, have you the required output output in terms of your strain capacity. So that's the first thing I would look at, and then I would use MRI as a guide to influence me in terms of a return play. I mightn't necessarily use MRI as the gold standard, but I definitely take it into account heavily when I suppose it's one of the tick boxes I would use. But again, I'd link it back to kind of your output and your strain capacity in terms of the way we now measure it with the H-rig in terms of that specific mechanism. If there's no symmetries present, if they're back to pre-injury levels, and if for us they're in low risk injury categories when they're returning to play, you'd kind of tend to kind of maybe be more confident and pushing them a little bit quicker. In this case, this guy was particularly in a low risk category in terms of his capacity, had really good output. So we let him off after 6.5 weeks, and thankfully there's been no issue so far.
Okay. When you talk to strain capacity and we're testing strain capacity, obviously you have an isometric measure there with H-rig. And well, I'm interested to hear what your true test of strain capacity looks like. So if it's just the one test, is there a magnitude of tests, and what do you think gives us all the information? Because I guess when we come back to talking around these hamstrings that often the troublesome ones, the ones that aren't getting better, are we missing something within our capacity testing potentially, whether it's certain range or at whatever length or positions? What do we need to be really clear on when we are testing for this, and what sort of targets shall we be looking at?
Really good question again, and really a big area of debate in the literature at the moment, and even among the clinical and science community. So there's two things I look at. First of all, and before my PhD, I didn't realize how important this is. The error of measurement. So in terms of the test you're using, what is their measurement? So we're looking for really small asymmetries. We look at hamstring injuries and the recurrence rate, and I think technical error measurement and the confidence intervals and intra reliability are really, really important when it comes to the testing we're using. The second thing coupled with that I think is really, really important, and I think we overlook this quite a lot, and it's I suppose it's really challenging, but the second thing I look at is the specificity. So in terms of your mechanism, okay, and that's the really big thing that we went after, was to be really specific to the mechanism. Can we test, specific to the mechanism? And when I look at, I suppose, prone, supine, and kneeling tests, I find it difficult and challenging myself to see how they translate into sport. So how sensitive are they going to be translate into sport to be effectively assessing our athletes? So they'd be the really two things I look at, is in terms of output and strain capacity. What is their measurement? Is it reliable? Is it repeatable? And also, is it sensitive, and is it specific? And one of the really things, I suppose, we started working with the clubs ourselves, and it wasn't until started working with clubs ourselves in kind of professional environment. The one big thing, they have a lot of time demands, and it's very time sensitive. And when they're assessing their players, they need to be reliable, and also need to be quick. So I suppose that's the other benefit of isometrics as well. But yeah, they'd be the two big things I go after, Nick, in terms of output and assessing capacity.
Okay, can you give us, so you personally would be testing, obviously, H-rig, and would there be any other testing that you would use? And then for whatever those two or one or two tests are, can you give us a metric, a target that you'd be looking for, that you'd like to see? And you mentioned like low level asymmetry. What is that? Obviously 10% gets thrown around a lot, but are we talking something less than that?
Yeah, so typically for H-rig, what we look at in terms of our clinical diagnosis, so we're looking at asymmetries. So generally for us, a grade 0 would be below 6% asymmetry. So look, when you're looking at maybe more grade 1A, 1Bs, you're looking at below like 12 to 15%. And when you're looking at like 2Cs and above, you're looking above that. And like 3Cs will present with 30 to maybe 50% of the deficit in asymmetry on the H-rig at the moment. in terms of capacity, then for injury prevention, what we look at is in terms of absolute force, you're looking at 7 newtons per kg, or in terms of torque, and we find torque to be the more sensitive measure in which we take account the length of the limb. So you're looking at 3 newton meters per kg. So in terms of absolute force, that equates to about 550 newtons. And in terms of relative torque, that equates to about 230 newtons. So all players that would hit those targets would be in a low risk category in terms of our H-rig assessment, in terms of prospective injury risk. So that's the kind of objective figures that we have looked at and researched over the last 3 to 4 years.
Okay. And the symmetry stuff you mentioned there around the different injuries, I'm assuming that's what you're seeing early on, but you would expecting symmetry essentially, or less than 6% for a return to play marker.
Yeah, exactly. So generally what we use as a return to run marker is isometric function at 100% MVIC, so that they can tolerate a full isometric function in that split stance or late swing, early stance position. So they have full function there. And then what we tend to do is we tend to run them then kind of in zone 3 thereafter. So like upwards of 50-60% pace of max speed. We give them high volumes of running coupled with isometrics in those positions, and we find it really effective in terms of dosing. And I know there's different models and stuff in relation to return to play and rehab as well.
So would that mean you're sometimes delaying that running, early stage running? So let's say because you're looking to get 100% or symmetry between the two, that might take 7 days, give or take, I'm predicting. So it might be they're not running for 7 days rather than, say, slow jogging at day 3 or 4. You're skipping those bit of slow jogs, but you're going straight to quality. Is that right?
Yeah, so in relation to that 3C we spoke about there, if we take that 3C, for example, we would have began some isometric work on him at 48 hours post-injury. So we would have began loading him safely 48 hours post-injury. We would have probably loaded him for the next 7 to 10 days to get his symmetry down to in around that 10% mark. During that period, he would have built up to maybe 100% of an MVIC, and then we would have ran him at that stage. So okay. The reason I do that, to be honest, is that when you look at the research in terms of Chris Brama's research and in terms of a lot of the work, really good research that's been done on running mechanics following hamstring injury, we know there are some deficits and compensatory effects of hamstring injury on running mechanics. So I tend to think to myself, okay, if we can build capacity, does it reduce those, I suppose, issues around the running mechanics? Are we more likely to have less issues in terms of running mechanics, and more effective, I suppose, mechanical output when we're running? Okay. So that would be my kind of general kind of go-to on that.
Cool. And obviously for the 3C there, if this was just a lesser grade injury, so let's say I don't know, 2B, what have you, just a biceps fem injury, are you doing that same sort of process? And if so, when are you seeing those sort of numbers come about and running? Are you seeing that at day 3, 4, or are you seeing that at day 6 or 7? Just for argument's sake, to compare for a routine hamstring.
Yeah, I would say probably, Nick, to be honest, the longer one, so day 6 to 7. What we tend to do here as well, so we're lucky we have the H-rig, but we can see the outputs on the in terms of the force and the work done. So generally what you'll find in that, first 5 to 7 days, the guys will be putting out maybe about 300-400 newtons safely, So I think that's where the benefit of it is that you're getting like effective and really dosing players effectively, safely in pain-free ranges. Whereas I look at kind of maybe if you're looking at the traditional rehab, okay, say for example, in terms of single leg bridges and your loading and your isometrics there, like if you look at it from this perspective, I suppose, and this is the way I do try and frame it myself, all those exercises probably come in maybe between 100 to maybe 150 newtons if you're lucky in terms of applied strain, whereas we're seeing players dosing on the H-rig like maybe 3, 4, 5 times that. And then I'm looking at the running, and I'm thinking, okay, the quicker we get these guys back running, because they're going to put out maybe about 2,000 newtons. So if we can build the capacity and output to get them running and get them 50%, 60% of max speed, is that going to accelerate our return to play and give them, I suppose, build a bit more robustness in them going forward? So it's not a perfect model, but it's one we've kind of researched and been using over the last number of years here with the H-rig to try and accelerate and reduce their recurrence rate that we're speaking about.
Yep. No, I like it. If obviously going off track a little bit here for maybe what we discussed, we're going to talk through. But anyway, so running and high level running, you've said applied strain. You mentioned 2,000 newtons. Correct me if I'm wrong here. And obviously, how you a low level exercise, let's call it the hamstring bridge, with your heel up on the bench, and is like a low level 150 you mentioned. And if I can do a high dose isometric, and I might get 5 times that. Out of interest in your experience, so I don't have a H rig or I'm not really using a isometric. What are some of those steps you might see from my applied strain from an exercise dosage that I might get in the gym? So can you give us examples of that, give or take from your estimates? Let's say a couple of routine hamstring exercises, single leg RDLs, a Nordic, a hamstring curl, or something like that. Where do you see the applied strain being higher? And and that probably leads you into some of your high level running base exercise, I'd imagine.
Yeah, really interesting again. So, like, if I look at the different tiers, I suppose you've got tier one, your low level isometrics. So, if you're doing, as you say, your single leg bridge, your supine single leg bridge, at your various long lever legs. So, for example, if you're 70 to 100 kgs, that's what 70 to 100 newtons. That's a strain through that. If you're looking at it, maybe more a kind of performance-based exercise, maybe like a deadlift, like our players deadlift. So majority of players deadlift. So our probably highest player would be maybe in around the 200 kg mark. So that's 200 newtons of applied force through that hamstring. And similarly with RDLs, if you're doing like RDLs with barbells and dumbbells, like you're looking at maybe 70, 80 newtons. So I think we need to be mindful of where that rehab sits in terms of the applied strain and dosing our players, and in terms of, I suppose, effectively maximizing the strain capacity and therefore the output. So when you look at kind of H-rig and the figures that we're looking at dosing players maybe between 300 to 500 newtons. So we're probably in the middle there. If you take running is 2,000. So I suppose they're the different kind of tiers we need to be mindful of. And some really good research published over the last number of years has spoke about how the importance of getting guys running, getting guys on grass. And I think that's really important when you kind of frame it in kind of those 3 tiers in terms of your general rehab to begin with, your low level, then your performance work or your performance rehab, then your H-rig work, and then effectively then you have your higher strain in your running and your muscle tendon forces of 2, 3, 4,000 newtons depending on your body weight and what speed you're going at.
Yeah. So basically, you can't quite get near that strain levels unless you're running fast, which comes back to a lot of the research. Yep.
Yeah, and that's the problem. Like, that's and that's the rehab. I know we're saying it's a science, but it can be it's more an art too, and it comes down to a lot of experience and I suppose learning from her. Like I'm 20 years now between working as a sports scientist, physiologist, and a sports medicine clinician and stuff. And it does take a while for the penny to start dropping bit by bit, and it does take a while for it to drop.
Yeah. Now we touched on around obviously some of those other factors that you mentioned around. You touched on fascial length. We touched on around some of the posterior chain function. I guess without trying to delve too deep, but from just thinking back through some experiences of some cases, whether it's this one or other ones that you've had that you haven't seen go well, if I'm a practitioner out there and I'm listening to this and I've got a hamstring that's not going too well and I'm trying to wrap my brain and think, what am I potentially missing here? What are a couple of the big rocks that you would sort of look to? I guess sitting away from the strength stuff a little bit. So some things you might, even talking to, we talk around the running and how to dose that is probably one really big thing that, if it's a big rock for an example. But yeah, what have you seen over the time, and are we missing things? Is it around the ankle and knee joints or wherever else that you would, if I brought a patient to you, what would you look a little deeper at?
Okay. To answer that first question, if you brought a patient to me, the first thing I look at is holistically. I look at their alignment. I go through their feet, go through their alignment, hip, knee, ankle, go through the mobility of each joint. As prior to assessing, going through the specific hamstring assessment. So I'd take a holistic view initially to begin with. That's the first thing I would do. I suppose to answer your question in, I suppose, two different ways, if that's okay. First of all, if I had a patient from a clinical point of view that I haven't ran at this stage and I'm just not happy with him, he's just not clearing up and we're not getting anywhere. The first thing I would always go to as a go-to is your palpation and location. So where is your location? What exact site are you dealing with? And just think about the underlying morphology and architecture around those sites. That'd be the first thing. Second thing, and I've done this in the past to hold up my hands here, is like the effect of sometimes discogenic issues that don't present in your clinical exam. So, like, definitely MRI in terms of lumbar spine is important. And I have to hold my hands up. In the past, I've missed that in terms of the effect of the neural function, that might be presenting clinically, that might have an effect on the hamstring. Because I know even from speaking to the guys in Liverpool, they do a lot of work on EMG activity in terms of returning players to play in terms of medial and lateral hamstrings. And that's obviously going to present there in terms of EMG signals. So that would be kind of the clinical side of it. And then they would be my two go-tos in terms of location palpation and imaging for the lumbar spine. As well as that as a holistic view around the other joints and the effect of those that may pose on the hamstring. But I suppose that's more a preventative kind of aspect to it. Then if you're running into a brick wall when you get players back running, I think load is important. Previous activity level, like sometimes what you find with some hamstrings, as you have mentioned throughout our talk here, is that they're recurrent. Like, how much time have they spent on grass? Have they trained fully over the last 6 months? Have they trained fully over the last 12 months? Are they stop and start? Do you need to take a little bit more of a graduated response to your running loads, because these guys haven't trained fully or haven't built the load capacity or the chronic load over 3, 6, 12 months? And I think that's a really important aspect when you come to it as well. So they would be my big go-tos. In terms of clinical, it would be palpation, location, MRI, in terms of your lumbar spine if you're not happy. And then in terms of running, look at their previous load and maybe take a more graduated response to it.
Beautiful. Couple of nice little tips, and just always come back to, I think, as you say, couple of holistic aspects where you're looking at the body, but also looking at the way it's been loaded and put together. And then clearly you've gone, and nailed down around some of the hamstring aspects. I'm pretty keen to move on to, you've talked around trying to, I guess, tease out and navigate through those troublesome cases in what we might want to look through. And we've talked to rehab in the sense of the isometric loading and into some commencement of running.
Yeah.
What are some other avenues you fill us in a little bit more on some of the other aspects you would work through from a hamstring rehab? And I guess in this case, we're probably talking around, strain capacity and then into the applied strain and the running base work. But at the moment, thinking around gym and strength, fill us in on a little bit of some of the key aspects that you look at, probably aside from the isometric component.
Yeah, and it's a really kind of interesting area, kind of the performance gym in relation to hamstring prevention as well. What we have in Gaelic football, and it might be similar in other sports, is from my perspective, working with teams over the last 20 years and stuff, is that we have a sport that involves kicking, a lot of anterior chain. when we look at our S&C programs, there's a lot of jumping, a lot of, I suppose, emphasis on knee drive as well and anterior chain there. A lot of loading through the anterior chain. So what we're trying to do at the moment is bias our performance programs more towards the posterior chain. And we found that really effective if we have a really good balance there. And even with some of our really troublesome hamstrings, we've just become really, really posterior chain biased. So like we all know the various posterior chain exercises and the importance of glute activation, glute control. Obviously, your gastroc-soleus complex is really important as well. Obviously, we've already spoken about the importance of the output and strain capacity of the hamstrings itself. So I think from a performance point of view, that is one thing I have worked hard on. The guys that are really experiencing long-standing issues in terms of posterior chain, biasing the posterior chain, and even in terms of like lumbar spine as well, and T-spine as well. A lot of posterior chain work in those areas as well, and try to become more biased towards there because they're involved in a sport that is going to bias them that way anyways because of knee drive kicking and as well. So that's one of the things that we're working heavily on here.
Yeah, cool. Why don't you give us give me a few examples? I know you said just to sort of wrap it up, everyone knows posterior chain, but probably hamstring targeted posterior chain. Give me some examples of exercises around your hip function stuff. So is it hip thrust work you really highly value? Is it more, I guess, positional stuff on like the glute ham raises, or are we talking some obviously hinge pattern work, et cetera, just so we can visualize a couple of things on what you're talking about. And then also when you're talking lumbar spine and thoracic spine, how is that maybe coming into our exercise prescription as well?
Yeah, so what I try to do with my programs is I have about maybe 10 or 12 go-tos that I use, whether they're hip, knee, or hinge pattern dominant. So I'd always put in one of each of those into each program. And what we tend to do every 10 days or so is we tend to change that exercise. So for example, RDLs, hip thrusts that you spoke about, we will do glute ham raise. We'll do H3 quite a lot to dose them on that as well. So we will change that up considerably over a month period where they're changing and not become, I suppose, reliant on any of those exercises. Because another thing I think about as well, Nick, when I'm prescribing them is I know like we're trying to bias proximal and distal portions, and we're trying to bias medial and lateral portions as well. And so in terms of compartmentalizations, I know that's important if you've had previous injury in in any of those areas. But I think what's really important is in terms of our strain capacity as well is that how heavy can we dose them? In which of those exercises is going to dose them? Kind of maximize that dosage in terms of the newtons that they're going to put through that hamstring complex, whether it's medial lateral or proximal distal biased. So that's what we tend to do in relation to those exercises.
All right. And so what would a benchmark or a level being for a double leg RDL or a single leg RDL exercise? Do you have a sort of load that you sort of try to get at an elite athlete to that you think's at the level required?
Yeah, like I suppose our heavier guys are trying to push out 200 kgs. On Bosch rolls, we're trying to build on the single leg Bosch. We're trying to build in obviously first of all body weight to be able to tolerate that, but we're building in like on top of that 20 to maybe 80 kgs in terms of Bosch hold as well. So we're trying to improve that capacity and output as much as we can in that positions. And the other thing that I think is really important now, I don't have the answer for this, and some of your listeners might be more knowledgeable than listening to me, but I think like for me, if we're dosing guys in that isometric position in terms of that outer range as well, how far does it go into the inner range? So like if we're dosing players at 150 degrees of knee extension, how far into inner range does it go? Is it effective into improving performance in a range? I don't know. It probably does. We recently had a sprinter we're working with who we've used the Bosch holes there. he began at body weight, so he couldn't tolerate 20 degrees or 20 seconds. He's 82 kg, so he couldn't tolerate 20 seconds. Now he's working at 50 kgs in a butt hold, and you want to see his output in terms of his eccentric Nordic fall. Now it's really good. So I think there's definitely translation between and crossover between isometrics, eccentrics, and concentrics. It definitely has to be, because you're at the end of the day you're building output. So there's definitely crossover into the various contraction modes as well, I think.
Yeah,
I don't
nice.
have I can't say that for certain because I don't have the science behind it. That's my theory.
That's okay. Out of interest, just to sort of wrap some of that up there on, I mean, you mentioned some of the loads there. We'll talk just to the Bosch hold. What sort of times are we talking? You said 20 seconds to body weight. As we're going heavier, are we to 40 kilos, what have you? Are we still doing that to 20 seconds, or are we bringing that down and sets and reps? Give us your example sets and reps for something you'd use in a hamstring rehab program.
Yeah, so I suppose the ramping the isometrics there, for your listeners there, Power et al. 2023, they have a really good paper on ramping isometrics at the moment on the return to play of a hamstring injury there, a total rupture. So that's really good. So normally what we would do, as you said, we probably wouldn't go more than 20 seconds. So at the moment what we would do is five reps of 20-second holds, with generally 1-to-1 recovery or 1-to-2 recovery. Then we would, as we go ramping up the weight, okay, we would take it down to 10-second holds, 5-second holds, and also down to your hold and lift for a second and back down again. So you're looking at, like, I suppose, reps of 20 seconds. You're looking at building for 10-second holds. You're looking between 8 to 10. For 5-second holds, you're looking around 12 reps of that. And then maybe for your 1-second holds, you're looking between 12 and 15 reps as well. And obviously you can take down that 12, 15 reps if you're putting in more load as well. So if you're really dosing plays heavily, for example, 80 kgs in a Bosch hold, that would be like, might be only a set of 5 or 8 isometric 1-second holds and back down again. So that's the kind of way we do dose it and ramp it.
Okay, interesting. And the ramping isometric paper 2023, who was that again, just for reference point?
Power et al. 2023. It's a really good one on the return to play and ramping isometrics following total hamstring rupture.
Cool. All right. I'm not aware of that one, so it might be one we go and read next. Sounds good. Okay. Now, to sort of bring things together, now it's funny when we always have like my little question around prevention or what have you at the back end, and clearly everything we've sort of spoken to falls in line with that to a degree. But let's say we've had someone who's had a recurring hamstring and we've got them back to play and they've played well. Then for the next 3 months, we're sort of really don't want another issue. What sort of things can we, if there's one or two key things we are tracking and addressing? So obviously we've probably got some isometric strength measures there that we're going to really feed on and rely on. And so if maybe talk to that, and then what are some of the other things that probably stand out to you as our biggest rocks that we just need to really stay consistent with?
So if we go back to our kind of tiered model again, so if you go back to running first of all, so in terms of running, what is their chronic load like? So previous to the injury, how much load, what does their chronic load look like? So obviously you've got to be mindful of that in terms of stressing them around that, maximizing it, pushing them as much as you can, but also allowing enough recovery between pitches and game sessions. So that's the first thing. Obviously, in terms of that, the guys that have higher chronic load, obviously it's safer to push them. And the really big thing in the literature, we know that previous injury is a big factor. So we need to be mindful of that in terms of going forwards, in terms of loading them safely and exposing to matches and competitions. So that would be the first big rock. The second rock, I'm going to bore you with it again, but strain capacity, what's their output? So what zone are they in? Are they at low risk? Have you returned them to play and they still have poor output? So are they still at low risk or high risk in terms of their output? We need to determine that in terms of their capacity. So again, that affects your decision-making process in terms of your exposure to run and load again, because we know running load, as you've mentioned, is the go-to. We need to get them out there and keep them on the grass as much as possible. So that would be the second thing. And then the third thing, in terms of the performance and the performance gym and the rehab, to be totally honest, Nick, I'm starting to go away from it, and I'm starting to lose not a little bit of faith in it, but like the numbers that we're talking about there, like in terms of the newtons and the exposure to applied strain there, like there's way more benefit in keeping them running. And I don't know is in terms of when you see the recurrence rate of muscle injury, particularly hamstrings, is like as we alluded to there, if you're in the gym doing 100 newtons or 200 newtons maybe, is that really going to effectively protect you? And is it from a performance point of view, like in a time sensitive manner, when professionals, when performance teams, when managers, when the whole professional environment is becoming more time sensitive because of the pressures that's involved, because of the amount of games that's now played, and like we need to be really smart the way that we dose players in terms of making sure that we're increasing their capacity so that they're at low risk. So they would be my big go-tos.
Okay, cool. Great way to wrap things up. Martin, is there now, mate, to sort of bring things to a close? I don't think there's, too much we've missed there that we'll squeeze into a podcast, but obviously really enjoyed having you on board. We did have recently posted a blog article piece written by your good self up on the SportsMap website. So we haven't actually promoted that just yet, but that'll be out by the time this podcast comes out. So if people haven't read that, I encourage you to read that. And mate, we'll obviously put your email and things like that within the show notes if you're comfortable with that, so people can connect. And I'm sure both from a hamstring point of view and seeking some of your research and work out there, as well as maybe trying to get a look at how Hatred can help people. I'm sure that's a nice avenue for them.
Brilliant, and thanks for all your help. Really enjoyed the podcast. Hope I didn't waffle too much, and looking forward to the weekend as well.
Yeah, nice, mate. It's great to connect. Thanks for your time, and we'll chat to you soon. Thanks, mate.